Previously in the complete creation.
Buried together with the dinosaurs, which were killed by drowning and preserved by rapid burial. It is all powerful evidence for a global flood. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me in this exhaustive journey of the science, history, philosophy, and theology of the creation-evolution controversy. We've been studying the foundations of the old Earth mythologies, which are the roots of evolutionism. This whole old Earth idea was specifically invented to replace the historic worldwide flood of Noah's time, as recorded in the Bible. Millions, perhaps billions of years were invented and invoked as an alternative story to explain away the profound and overwhelming evidence of the past global flood. As a result, this belief in deep time gained a huge following, not because of the scientific evidence, but rather because of philosophical assumptions. Now, some honest skeptics have raised questions about the rock layers we find around the world that we creationists would contend were formed by the great worldwide flood of Noah's day. Some of these questions are good questions that actually open the door to lengthy and fascinating discussion, which also reveal the fallacies of the assumptions of deep time. Now, the NCSE can hardly be called honest skeptics. There's reasons I fondly and sarcastically call them the National Center for Science Eradication, mostly because of their hard work at trying to proselytize the world with their science, falsely so called. But in their many writings, they do serve the purpose of being a springboard for honest discussion in spite of their downright dishonest treatment of the actual scientific evidence. In their article, The Fatal Flaws of Flood Geology, they write, "Let's begin with the problems posed by fossil desert deposits. You don't need a PhD in geology to know that desert dunes and other desert deposits do not form under roaring floodwaters. These require not only time, but also dry land. The flood of Noah supplies neither." There are multiple examples of what they claim are fossil desert deposits from around the world, and one of the more famous examples can be found in the middle of the massive stratigraphic sequence exposed in Grand Canyon. The Coconino Sandstone Formation is a thick layer of beautiful, bright white sandstone that makes dramatic vertical cliffs hundreds of feet thick in the Grand Canyon. You can see here in this photo, though the face of the cliffs have been stained red by the erosion of the dark red rock layers above it, the rain dissolves some of the dark red rock and washes down the face of the bright white rocks below it, staining them red. I have some slabs here of some of that bright white Coconino sandstone right here. Notice also that there is fossil footprints within the sandstone. In fact, there's a lot of fossil footprints in the Coconino sandstone, and they tell a story which we will dive into. But first, let's take a tour of some of the other alleged fossil desert deposits in the rock record so you can first understand why they contend that the Coconino sandstone and other rock formations are fossilized deserts. Let's take a drive over to Nevada to Red Rock Canyon, where the Visitor Center will tell you the rock layers there are fossilized desert sand dunes. Now, why would they say this? It's primarily based on the same reason it is claimed that the Coconino Sandstone is a desert, because the layers are built up of crossbeds. Now, what are crossbeds? Let's head over to Zion National Monument, which is also claimed to be thousands of vertical feet of fossilized desert dunes because of the dramatic crossbeds that make up the layers. Now, let's take a close look at the sedimentary layers. Here's the individual layers. But wait, those layers are composed of other sloped layers within them. Now, how bizarre is that? If you take an even closer look, you'll see that the sloped layers, called crossbeds, are composed of three distinct parts. The crossbeds first curve down from the top of the layer, have a generally flat slope, and then curve out horizontal again at the bottom. The top curve is called the top set, the slope is called the foreset, and the bottom curve, where it levels out again, is called the bottom set. Where the distinguishable cross-bedded layers meet is called the bonding surface. The first time I ever saw crossbeds was back in 2005 when fellow creation researcher Stan Lutz and I were driving across West Texas. Now, Stan had taken some geological schooling, which was more in rock and mineral identification, and I hadn't taken any geological training. Geology and geomorphology were just really my passion. We came across this rock cut in the highway, and I sat there and stared at these bizarre tilted layers. What on earth would do that? And as I was about to find out by first-hand experimentation, there's actually a couple of different ways that could be made by both wind and water. However, Stan and I followed that layer for probably around 40 or 50 miles on our trip. I would contend that no wind will produce a uniform cross-bedded layer like that for such distances. So that leaves only one other option for its formation: water. The claim for these major crossbeds you see at Zion National Monument, Grand Canyon, Pecos Canyon, and many thousands of other places in North America alone is that they are actually desert sand dunes that became lithified. They turned to rock, like the rest of the sedimentary layers in the geological record. In fact, many geological textbooks will specifically rule out the possibility that formations like the Coconino Sandstone could be made by water, strangely claiming that dry sand can form steeper slopes than wet sand. Take, for example, Professor of Geology at MIT, Robert R. Shrock, who wrote in his textbook, Sequence in the Layered Rocks, "The steepest angle of repose for cross-laminated sands is about 33 degrees. So remember that number. This will become important shortly. Now, Dr. Shrock was contending that wind could produce steeper crossbeds than water. In fact, he was basically defining a specific angle here to help determine if a crossbed was wind-formed or water-formed. If it was steeper than 33 degrees, it had to have been formed by wind, because water could only produce crossbeds up to 33 degrees at most. Now, with respect to Dr. Shrock, I'm perplexed as to why he would write this and how he determined this angle, because just logically speaking, you can cement sand together into near vertical angles with water. You can't do that with dry sand. Go make a sandcastle on the beach. Do you use dry sand or wet sand? Well, wet sand, of course. Why? Because you can sculpt with it. Make even vertical surfaces with it. You can't do that with dry sand. So it's illogical to suggest that only dry sand could make steeper slopes than wet sand. Also, the hydraulic power of moving water to transport, form and compact loose sand is magnitudes more powerful than wind. Even low volumes of water moving relatively slow can move larger grains of sand farther and faster than any wind. Yet, this angle of repose has been brought up by anti-creationist skeptics as some kind of proof that the cross-bedded sandstones in question had to have been formed in a dry desert by wind and not water, because the angle of the crossbeds is steeper than 20 degrees. Now, this argument was more common about 10 years ago, but I'm still encountering some who make this erroneous claim. And many of these skeptics are smart people, including geologists. So why would they say this? How on earth did this contradictory interpretation become a defining feature of alleged desert dunes? I honestly do not know, but I do know you can trace this claim as far back as the 1930s and 40s. It can even be seen in the original research of McKee and others when they were trying to determine if the massive crossbed formations were formed underwater or subaerial on dry land. Now, back in 2006 through 2008, Emmy Clark, Professor Emeritus of Fluid Dynamics at the University of Illinois, Urbana, engineer Andrew Rodenbeck, and myself conducted weeks of experiments at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. Clark and one of his former students, Dr. H.D. Voss, constructed this rotary flume for sedimentary experiments, partly funded by the Creation Research Society. Basically, you would fill in the flume with water and sediments, and these large paddles, which would move the water and sediments in a flow around the perimeter. You stop the paddles, and as the water came to a stop, the sediments would drop out and form various sedimentary deposits. The hope was to study these formations in cross-section through the clear plexiglass walls. The entire flume could also be tilted at various angles in order to study the effect of uphill and downhill flows. Now, way back in the 1980s, Guy Berthault of France published a series of papers on his research in sediment stratification, and he has kindly provided copies of these papers online at his website, sedimentology.fr. He has even provided multiple videos of the experiments. His research included using water and sediments in linear flumes, that is, a straight line box with clear walls through which you ran water and sediments to observe sedimentary deposits. He made a series of surprising discoveries regarding the formation of sedimentary layers and formations underwater. For example, when Berthault blocked off the water flow with a metal plate at the end of the flume and continued to run water and sediments through, interestingly, he produced crossbeds. Now, back to Glen Rose. We wanted to replicate these results ourselves and hopefully further the study. Now, Rodenbeck and myself kind of objected to Berthault's procedure. After all, this was all being done to simulate in a small way the effects of a global flood. So we objected to this, dam being built in the flume. How on earth was that anything like what you would see in a global flood? What was this magical dam that appeared in nature during the onset of a worldwide flood that would cause the production of hundreds of meters of crossbeds all over Western North America? So we initially fired up the rotary flume and quickly learned of its limits. Now, it was very educational, but there were too many complex fluid dynamics going on that really limited the scope of our experiments. The water on the outside of the circular tank would have a higher speed than the inside diameter, so the sediments would settle out starting from the inside to the outside. As a result of the different velocities in the spinning water, we would get weird, vortices and helical formations. So yes, we got every sedimentary formation you could list. Cross-bedding, interfingering of layers, multiple layers, thinning into fewer layers, scours, you name it, we saw it. One serendipitous discovery that we spotted was we had purchased silica sand for the experiments, but also hand-shoveled dirt from the shores of the Biloxi River and threw them into the Flume as well. In that dirt, we had inadvertently scooped up a dead worm. By chance, when Andrew was sectioning the sediments for study after a run, he happened to cut the sediments exactly in the right spot as to reveal this worm we had not seen before. And here it was, a dead worm, and it was buried polystrate in the sediments. Now, this was interesting for a few reasons. If one found this worm preserved as a fossil, one would probably interpret such a find within an old Earth mindset. Clearly, the worm was burrowing, but no, this worm was dead. It was not burrowing, but was simply being moved by fast-flowing water and subsequently buried vertically and polystrate, its body now cutting through multiple fine laminations of sediments and bent over flat at the surface of the sediments. Now, this was also interesting because during the annual excavations for the famous dinosaur and fossil human footprints in the nearby Biloxi River, a preserved fossil worm was discovered one year, buried vertically in the solid limestone, just like the dead worm found in the Flume. Now, he was nicknamed Mighty Worm for his feat of being buried in the act of digging his way through millions of years of sediments. And of course, you can detect my satire there. Of course, this polystrate worm isn't cutting through millions of years of sediments because the millions of years are missing. So we then built a linear flume to conduct further experiments and removing the complex non-linear fluid dynamics. Now, as you can see here, it's just a clear box, just a box with clear sides through which we ran water and sediments. We specifically built it so we could modify the angle of the flume for our experiments. And the first thing we learned with the linear flume was that it was hard to not make sedimentary layers with moving water in any way, including water percolating up vertically through the sediments. We set the flume on an uphill angle of about 2 degrees to mimic the slope of land and what would happen when the waters of the worldwide flood first started to encroach upon the land. What happened? We immediately made dramatic crossbeds. The uphill slope of the land, combined with the rising water flowing onto the land, caused water to pool ahead of the moving water. The moving water carries sediments with it, but when it encounters the standing water, the flowing water stops. The sediments it was carrying are no longer being swept by the flow and are dropped. The flowing water acts just like a continuously advancing conveyor belt. Now, let us remember that many skeptics arguing against a global flood interpretation for the major crossbed formations found in Western North America used an angle of about 30 degrees as the defining feature of subaerial or subaqueous crossbeds. Shrock was very specific with 33 degrees. All right, let's put that claim to the test. As you can see here, we produced crossbeds almost 37 degrees with tremendous ease. In fact, Shrock's claim was brought to our attention by a professor of geology who happened to be visiting the museum that day and watched our experiments in amazement. He was the one who provided the reference from Shrock and noted how, at that time, that angle of repose was a major argument for the famous crossbeds around the world being interpreted as desert dunes. Ironically, The angle of repose is inversely proportional to the velocity of the incoming water. The faster the water, the shallower the angle. The slower the water, the steeper the angle. One could potentially argue that many of the stratigraphic layers we see around the world are actually crossbeds that are at extremely low angles due to being deposited by very high velocity water. In fact, we'll come back to that and revisit that concept later on. I wish to stay focused on the crossbeds of the West for now, as we are running out of time for this episode. So let's go back to the Coconino Sandstone crossbeds in Grand Canyon. As I previously mentioned, the Coconino Sandstone is populated with copious numbers of fossil footprints from lizards or amphibians. Strangely, no fossils of the animals themselves are found, just their footprints. And the trails tell a story. The trackways are almost always only going uphill on the crossbed foresets. It is rare to find any trails going downhill. Furthermore, while everyone believes that the creatures that made these trails of footprints had tails, it's very rare to see any impression of the creature's tails dragging in the sand. Here's an example of one such trail, which I believe you can still see today on the short hike down the Hermit Trail in Grand Canyon National Park. Now, this is the only trail I've ever seen in person and photographed that had the tail drag visible. Not only are the trails only going uphill, you can see here the creatures were crab tracking. That is, walking uphill with their toes pointing uphill, but walking sideways, as if they were fighting some force. The trails of footprints also show that the creatures apparently had magical abilities. If you look at the footprints, they start off deep and heavy depressions in the sand. Then the footprints get shallower and shallower, becoming claw impressions only, and then completely disappearing. Did these lizards evolve the ability to fly as they wandered over the desert dunes, or what? Or were these crossbeds and the trails of footprints actually made underwater, in direct contradiction to the claims that it was all a desert? And that these creatures were simply being buoyed up by the water and floated or swam away. Now, if you wish to claim the Coconino Sandstones are fossilized desert dunes, that's fine, but why then, if we invoke the present is the key to the past and look at modern day footprints in desert dunes, the trails, of course, go in all directions. And not just uphill. Everybody agrees that is not at all what we see in the Coconino Sandstones. While we were conducting our Flume experiments, my good friend Dr. Carl Baugh went over to the pet store and bought a couple of newts, amphibians. We put them in the Flume while we created crossbeds in the Flume. The newts instinctively wanted to swim against the current, but also we watched in amazement as one of the newts, being negatively buoyant, sat at the bottom set of the crossbeds as they were being formed. I'm pointing to one of the newts in this video, which is difficult to see because of the muddy water. Now, why would it hang out at that particular spot? Well, because this was the area with the least amount of current. It could just sit there and literally step up onto the sediments as they were being deposited. If it tried to leave, it instinctively went against the current flow, tried to walk uphill, eventually being buoyed up by the flowing waters and swept away. To say this is an exact match of the trails of footprints in the Coconino Sandstone is an understatement. The tails would have been buoyed up in the water, and thus rarely leaving an impression in the sand. The feet would leave deep impressions near the bottom, and lighter impressions, even only impressions of the claws themselves, higher up as the entire body of the creature was buoyed up and carried away by the current of water. The continuous flow of sediments riding the incoming water and being deposited from, just like from a conveyor belt, would have immediately buried the footprints, preserving them from the destruction of time. The trails of footprints match those of amphibians underwater during flooding, which, based on the size of the Coconino Formation, covered a huge portion of what is now the United States. It all matches a global flood beautifully.
Coming up in the next complete creation.
As can be seen here, scorpions are negatively buoyant. They sink in water, and they can survive for hours to days underwater. So fossilized scorpion tracks, or even if we were to find a fossilized scorpion body in the Coconino Sandstone, does not determine that the Coconino was desert deposits. Notice that this does not take into account the possibility that these alleged fossil trackways of scorpions are actually misidentified due to deep time assumptions imposed upon the rocks, and that these may actually be fossil footprints of the sea scorpion, a scorpion-like creature which lives in the sea. We'll ignore that possibility to favor the argument of the deep time advocates.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video on demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air. So please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.